The wind cut across the auction yard, like a blade whipping red dust into the air and burning Nita Yazzi's cheeks. She didn't flinch. Her bare hands clutched the cloth doll tighter to her chest, fingers stiff with cold and tension. The doll's stitched face had long since worn away, and one arm dangled by a thread, but it was the only thing she hadn't lost. They had lined them up like livestock. Children of all shades, shapes, and silences. Boys first sturdy and broad-shouldered, snatched up by farmers and ranchers who needed help with spring planting. Then the youngest girls, ones with blonde curls and delicate manners, the ones who were easy to imagine in a parlor. Nita had been passed over 3 times. Now she stood alone on the platform, 8 years old. Skin darkened by sun and ancestry, long black hair in tight braids tied with mismatched string. Her patchwork dress barely reached her ankles. Silence pressed on her from all sides as the auctioneer cleared his throat for the 4th time. Lot 17. He called out, his voice fraying with forced cheer. Miss Nita Yazzie, 8 years of age, healthy, can read and write, taught chores and sewing, from decent stock. Her mother was Dine, worked in a tailor's shop in Santa Fe before the sickness took her. Father unknown. Quiet child. No trouble. The crowd didn't stir. Boots shifted in gravel. Someone coughed. Nita's eyes swept the people, strangers wrapped in judgment. The women avoided her gaze. The men looked through her like she was fog. One farmer gave her a glance and shook his head. Too thin, he muttered to his wife. The auctioneer smiled harder. Surely someone could use an extra set of hands. No one spoke. No one moved. A sharp ringing started in Nita's ears. It always came before the panic did, before her chest closed in, before the sky tipped sideways. But she didn't cry. Not here. Not in front of them. She took a step forward. The doll swung in her arms like a pendulum. Then, with a voice barely louder than the wind, she said, "No one wants me." The world held its breath. Not a question. Not a plea. Just a statement. The auctioneer blinked, startled. Even the horses tied near the rail shifted uneasily, as if they understood the weight of her words. And then boot heels cracked against wood. 1, 2. The sound echoed like thunder. A man stepped from the shadow of the livery awning, tall, broad-shouldered, his long coat dusted from the trail, wide-brimmed hat low over his face. He moved with the kind of authority that didn't ask permission. The crowd parted without being told to. $50, he said, voice low, gravel-lined. I'll take her. Gasps scattered like dry leaves. $50 for a placement. Most men paid 10, if that. The auctioneer sputtered. Mr. Red Elk, Samuel, sir, I didn't realize you were. Didn't ask what you realized, Samuel Red Elk said. His eyes were on Nita. She stared back, stunned. The wind blew a strand of hair across her face. He looked like something out of a story, the kind told around fires, the kind with horses and thunder and lonesome ridges. His face was hard tan like sun-cured leather, his jaw set like a stone wall. But there was something behind his eyes, something heavy, familiar. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather wallet, laying the bills flat on the podium. Crisp, deliberate movements. Draw up the papers. She's coming with me. The auctioneer fumbled with his forms. Of course, we'll send them out to your ranch when they're notarized. Should only take a day? No. She leaves with me now. But she has no trunk, no clothes, I have blankets. She'll manage. He turned back to Nita and held out a hand. Not a command. An offer. She didn't move. Name's Samuel Red Elk, he said, voice gentler now. Got a ranch out north. Big place, empty rooms. Could use some company if you're willing. Her fingers twitched on the doll. I don't know you, she whispered. He nodded. I don't know you either. But I heard what you said up there. And I figure, if no one else wants you, maybe that means we've got something in common. Her throat ached. It always did when she wanted to believe something. She took a step, then another. Her hand reached out, hesitating a breath before resting in his. His palm was warm, rough, real. He helped her down from the platform. She stumbled once, and he steadied her without flinching. As they passed through the crowd, no one said a word. Samuel lifted her into the wagon as if she were glass. She said nothing as he climbed up beside her, flicked the reins, and turned the horses toward the mountains. The road stretched long and quiet. Trees rose like sentinels in the distance, their shadows growing taller as the sun dipped low. Half an hour passed before she spoke again. Why'd you really do it? He kept his eyes on the road. Because silence hurts, and you sounded like you'd lived with too much of it. She didn't answer, just held her doll closer and watched the planes fall behind them. A hawk soared overhead. Somewhere a creak whispered through the trees. I don't want to be sent back, she said suddenly. If I mess up, or if I'm not good at whatever this is. Samuel glanced at her, his jaw tight. You won't be sent back? How do you know? 'Cause I've spent years living with ghosts in a house too quiet to be called home. He paused. And I think maybe you're the only one who can teach it how to breathe again. She looked away, but her hand crept toward his sleeve and stayed there resting. The wagon rolled on, creaking with the rhythm of two lives trying to stitch themselves together. Ahead, the mountains glowed with the last light of day, and nestled in their shadow was Red Elk Ranch. A place that had been waiting whether it knew it or not. She didn't know what would happen next, but she wasn't standing alone on the platform anymore. The sky above Red Elk Ranch bled into a deep pink as the sun slipped behind the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The wagon creaked to a stop just outside the barn, where the air smelled of fresh hay horse sweat and pine resin. Nita sat stiffly, hands clenched in her lap, her doll pressed into her side. Her eyes flicked over the land like a cornered animal calculating, cautious, afraid to hope. We're home, Samuel said, stepping down. His boots hit the ground with a solid thud. Come on now. Nita hesitated. She didn't know what home meant anymore. It used to be her mother's humming at the sewing table, the smell of red chile stew, her laughter under thick quilts. Now it was strangers and stages and being stared at like a thing. She climbed down, slow and deliberate, her legs sore from the ride. The house stood proud, but worn a two-story rancher with peeling white paint wrap-around porch and crooked shutters. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a single oil lamp glowed in the front window. It looked like it hadn't been touched by joy in years. You'll sleep upstairs, Samuel said, nodding toward the porch. Room next to mine. Windows face the mountains. Gets cold, but I've got thick quilts. She followed him silently, her small boots crunching the frost-hardened ground. The porch creaked under their weight, and when he opened the door, warmth and shadows welcomed them in. Inside was clean but plain. Wood floors, worn rugs, a fireplace crackling softly in the corner. A painting of a wild Mustang hung above the mantel, its eyes fierce and free. From the kitchen, a voice called, About time I was starting to think the mountains ate you up. Nita froze. A woman with streaked gray-black hair and sleeves rolled to her elbows stepped out, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. Her eyes landed on Nita. Well, look at you, she said not unkindly. Aren't you a scrap of sugar? This is Clara, Samuel said. She keeps the place from falling apart, and me from forgetting to eat. Clara snorted. And don't you forget it. Nita stared at her, uncertain. Clara tilted her head. You like biscuits? Nita gave the smallest nod. Well, I made plenty. You get settled, then you come eat. Ain't no sense starting a new life on an empty belly. Samuel knelt beside her, voice low. You don't have to talk much if you don't want to. Just eat. Rest. Watch. This place moves slow. You'll catch the rhythm. She blinked once. Then she followed him up the stairs. Her room smelled like cedar and clean linens. The bed was tall and wide, the quilt hand-stitched with reds, browns, and desert gold. A single shelf above the bed held a tiny carved horse and a silver concho box. The window looked out over a field sloping down to a narrow creek where horses grazed under the bruised sky. Samuel left her there, closing the door with a soft click. She didn't cry. She never cried anymore. But she sat on the edge of the bed legs, dangling doll in her lap, and breathed in the quiet. No orphanage screams, no auctioneer's gavel, just the wind through the pines and the distant creak of floorboards below. She didn't know how long she sat there before hunger pulled her downstairs. Clara had already set 2 plates. Samuel was nowhere in sight. He's out with the horses, Clara said, pouring milk into a tin cup. Man spends more time in the barn than he does breathing regular air. Nita slid into the chair. The biscuits were warm, buttery, and flaked apart in her mouth. A bowl of rabbit stew followed, rich and earthy with carrots and wild herbs. She ate like a ghost, afraid it might vanish if noticed. Clara didn't press. She just refilled her milk when it got low and hummed a soft tune that reminded Nita of her mother's lullabies. You're not the first one to sit at this table with more questions than years behind him, Clara said gently. And you won't be the last. But this place, Red Elk, it's got a way of making space for the bruised parts. Nita looked up from her bowl. Why did he take me? Clara didn't answer right away. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked toward the window where the last light was fading. Because Sam knows what it feels like to be left behind, she said. He was taken from his family young boarding school back east. They tried to scrub the DNA out of him with books and whippings, but some things don't wash off. Nita frowned. He's DNA. Clara nodded. Mother's side. He don't talk about it much, but it's there. In the way he rides. In the way he listens. You'll see. The back door opened with a chill gust, and Samuel stepped in, stomping snow from his boots. He saw them at the table and paused. She eat every crumb, Clara said. Took to the stew like a barn cat. He nodded, pleased. Good. Come morning, I'll show you the horses, Nita. Got a mare that might like your voice. Nita didn't know what to say, so she nodded. That night, sleep came in fits. The walls groaned with old age. An owl hooted somewhere near the barn. At one point, she thought she heard Clara humming downstairs. But in the quiet that followed, she opened her eyes and whispered into the dark. If no one wants me, then why do I feel safe here? The doll didn't answer, but for the first time in weeks, Nita pulled the quilt over her shoulder and let herself drift into sleep without dread. Outside her window, the stars were bright and close, but in the barn beyond the quiet, something else was stirring, an uneasy horse, a slamming latch, a shadow crossing the far stalls. The peace of Red Elk Ranch, it seemed, would not last untouched. The morning air on Red Elk Ranch was crisp and biting, the kind that pinched cheeks and made the breath cloud thick. Nita stood outside the barn, arms folded tight across her chest, watching Samuel's silhouette moving inside. The light from the barn window spilled across the snow, casting long shadows. You don't have to be afraid of the dark, he said, his voice steady from inside. But you do have to respect it. She hesitated at the threshold, her fingers wrapped around the worn edges of her coat sleeves. It was the same barn from the night before, the same eerie creak, the same scent of haywood and horse sweat, but somehow it felt different in the daylight. Less like a secret, more like a place waiting to know her. The quote echoed in her mind as he turned toward her, brushing his hands off on his pants. "Go ahead," he said, nodding to the mare in the corner stall. "She's waitin' on you." The horse was dapple gray, soft-eyed with a cautious tilt to her ears. Nita moved slowly, her boots crunching on straw, her heart drumming in her ears. She whispered something, not even words, really just breath and sound, and the mare shifted, then stepped forward. Samuel watched silently, leaning against a post. She's Moonlight, half wild, born under an eclipse. Doesn't trust easy. But she listens to people who carry pain quiet. Nita reached out her fingers, grazing the mare's muzzle. Warm, real, trembling a little, just like her. Clara appeared at the barn door, wiping her hands on a towel. "Thought you might want something hot before your fingers freeze clean off. Made fry bread and honey butter." Nita's eyes flicked to Samuel, unsure if she was allowed to leave. He nodded. "Go on. Moonlight's not going anywhere." Inside the kitchen smelled of cinnamon and sizzling lard. Nita sat at the table, her face still flushed from the cold. Clara set a plate in front of her, golden rounds of fry bread steam, rising butter melting into the folds. "Don't get used to this kind of spoiling," Clara warned. "I only cook like this when I'm nervous." Nita tilted her head. Nervous Clara poured 2 cups of sassafras tea. "Sam's brother's coming." The words sat heavy between them. Nita didn't even know Samuel had a brother. "Name's Otis," Clara continued. "You'll hear him before you see him. Loud, fast-talkin'. Bit of a snake with a silver tongue. He got the brains between them if you ask him." Nita nibbled the edge of her fry bread. "Why's he coming?" "Some business with the ranch papers. He shows up whenever money gets involved. But I think there's more to it. Always is with him." Nita tried to picture a man like Samuel, but louder. She couldn't. When Otis arrived that afternoon, it was on a gleaming chestnut stallion coat, too fine for work, and boots without a scratch. He wore a long shearling coat and a hat tipped just enough to show off a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well, I'll be," he said, dismounting with flair. This, the little shadow I heard about Samuel, stepped forward, arms crossed. "Otis, this is Nita. Nita, this is my brother." Otis crouched in front of her, eyes too sharp, smile too wide. "You got a name like a sunrise. That means you bring light to dark places." Nita stared at him, then took half a step behind Samuel. Otis stood with a chuckle. "She's got good instincts." They didn't shake hands. That night, the house held a strange tension. Otis talked and talked about land prices, the town expanding, how much the ranch could fetch if they sold part of the west pasture. Samuel didn't say much, just stirred his beans and stared at the fire. Nita listened from the stairs, clutching the banister. "She ain't your blood," Sam Otis said at one point. "You sure you want to saddle yourself with a child in these times? World's getting lean." Samuel's voice was quiet but firm. "She belongs here. And what happens when someone comes looking? You think no one's going to ask questions about a DNA man adopting a girl with no papers and no people? Even in New Mexico, people still whisper." "Let 'em whisper," Samuel said. Nita pulled back into the shadows, her heart thudding. For a moment, the barn felt safer than the house. Later, unable to sleep, she crept out into the hallway and padded toward the barn in her nightdress and boots too big. The wind howled across the field, tugging at her hair. She slipped through the barn doors and climbed the rail of Moonlight's stall. The mare snorted softly, but didn't shy away. I don't know if I belong here, she whispered. But he said I do. And he doesn't lie. Behind her footsteps. She froze. Couldn't sleep either. Samuel's voice was low, not scolding. She turned toward him wide-eyed. He stepped into the light carrying a blanket. Figured you might end up out here. She said nothing. He draped the blanket around her shoulders and leaned against the rail beside her. When I was 10, he began, they sent me east. Said I needed to learn the ways of the white man. Boarding school, suits, spoons for every meal. Not one word of Dene allowed. I forgot my mother's lullaby before I forgot my multiplication tables. Nita looked at him, eyes round. They tried to make me something I wasn't, and I let them for a while. Then I came back, and this land, it remembered me. He looked at her, then really looked. Sometimes the earth chooses you before anyone else does. She blinked fast. He doesn't like me. Otis doesn't like much of anything that don't make him richer. But this place isn't built on gold, it's built on grit, and you're kind of quiet. That's the strongest kind there is. She leaned her head against Moonlight's flank, the warmth grounding her. Samuel smiled. You're not just a guest here, Nita. You're part of the story now. A distant thunder rolled across the valley, not weather, but hooves. Samuel's brow furrowed. That's too many horses for midnight. He stood straight alert and scanned the horizon. Nita climbed down, her breath visible in the air. Samuel's voice was tight. Stay close. Outside, torchlight flickered beyond the trees. A group of riders. Trouble had come to Red Elk Ranch. And it came fast. I may not be yours by blood, Nita said, but I know who stands between me and the cold. The hooves were thunder on the frozen dirt, growing louder as the riders emerged from the dark line of the pines. Samuel stood in the open, his long coat catching the wind, the barn's lantern behind him, casting a hard silhouette. Nita clung to the barn wall blanket, still wrapped tight around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the men coming fast down the rise. 4 of them, maybe 5, hard to tell through the dark and snow. The lead rider wore a wide hat and a long oilskin coat. His horse foamed at the mouth, and his face was drawn with cold and something meaner. Samuel didn't flinch. Otis stepped out from the porch, boots echoing. What in God's name is this? He barked. The lead rider reined in. Name's Harlan Finch. This here's railroad property now. Y'all are squattin'. Samuel's brow furrowed. This land's been in our family 3 generations. You got papers, Harlan spat into the snow. I got an agreement with your brother. West pasture and the barn. For extension and survey rights. Otis's silence cracked like ice. Samuel turned his head slow. You sold it, loaned it, Otis said, shrugging. Temporary lease. You didn't tell me. I didn't think I needed your permission, Sam. A muscle ticked in Samuel's jaw. Nita could see it from the barn. Clara appeared on the porch, arms crossed, rifle slung casually over one shoulder. This is family land, she said. Harlan laughed. Not anymore. My men'll be setting up by morning. I suggest you move your livestock. You ain't bringing men through my barn. You got a choice, Harlan asked, stepping off his horse. Or are we going to let the courts chew on this for 6 months while I break ground? Nita's heart pounded. She didn't understand all of it. Leases railroads' rights, but she understood one thing. The barn was theirs. It was safety. It was where Moonlight lived. And it was where Samuel had come to find her in the dark. Harlan stepped toward Samuel, puffed up like a man who'd never lost a fight. I suggest you sign the rest of the deed before morning, or I'll bring more than papers. Otis, sheepish, kept to the porch. Samuel didn't move. This ranch ain't for sale, and it ain't for taking, Harlan smirked. You got no idea how easy it is to erase people like you. Red skin, no deed of title, just dust and memory. Samuel's voice came low and dangerous. We are not dust, and memory ain't weak, Harlan turned. Tomorrow, I come back with surveyors and stakes. Better clear the barn? They rode off as fast as they came, the sound of hooves receding like thunder across the mesa. The silence after was colder than the wind. Clara stepped down, fury burning behind her eyes. Otis, she hissed. You signed land to that snake. I didn't think he'd push it, Otis said. It was supposed to be a formality, just enough for collateral. Times are hard. Samuel stared at him like he didn't recognize his own brother. Nita, shaking, crept from the barn. You're not going to let him take it, are you? Samuel looked at her, then eyes softening, not a single board. They met in the kitchen later, all five of them around the table. Otis sat with arms crossed, scowling. Clara paced. Samuel stood with his hand on the old map nailed to the wall, weathered hand-drawn lines showing fences and water rights. He can't take what he can't find, Clara said. We can move the stock out the back pasture, make it look abandoned. Won't stop him, Samuel said. He wants that land for the track. We need to prove we still own it, prove his lease doesn't cover the barn. Otis scoffed. And how are you going to do that? You don't have the original deeds. Grandfather never filed. He trusted handshakes and prayer. Samuel turned. We have the story, the oral record. I've got the tribal council's witness. They know this land was given to him by Jose Gutierrez for helping during the winter raids. Story's not going to beat contracts, Otis muttered. It might. If we bring the right people to hear it. Nita spoke up. I want to help. All eyes turned. I remember things she said, voice quiet but sure. I see things when people talk. I can draw it. If you tell me the story, I can show them. Samuel nodded slowly. That's something. The rest of the evening passed in urgency. Clara wrote letters to the tribal council. Samuel rode out to speak to neighbors, ranchers, anyone who might know a way to block the claim. Otis sulked in the parlor, staring at the fire, too ashamed to help, but too stubborn to leave. Nita sat at the kitchen table listening as Clara told the story of the land. It was winter so cold the cattle froze standing up, Clara began. Jose was dying from fever, and your grandfather, he brought him medicine on foot in the snow. That's how this land came to us. Jose marked it with stones. The South Ridge, the sycamore tree that grows sideways. Nita sketched as she listened, her fingers nimble. The map forming on the page was part memory, part story, part truth, the kind of truth that lives longer than ink. At dawn, Harlan returned with 3 wagons and 2 men in suits. They brought stakes and maps and orders signed by a county clerk. Samuel met them on the front drive, rifle slung but barrel down. You're trespassing, he said. You're stalling, Harlan replied. Samuel held out the drawing. This map's been filed with the tribal authority and the Land Stewardship Council. You move past that line, you'll be violating sovereign trust. The man in the suit frowned. You got proof, Samuel pointed. That tree's over 100 years old. Bent sideways from a storm in 1882. You cut that down, the whole town'll hear. They hesitated. Harlan's lip curled. You think some tree's gonna stop a railroad behind him? Clara appeared with the tribal representative, an elder wrapped in turquoise and wool, flanked by 2 council observers. Not the tree, she said. The memory. The elder nodded toward Nita, who stepped forward and held up the map. This is our land, she said. You just haven't heard it sing yet. For the first time, Harlan didn't have words. Samuel's voice was a whisper carried by wind. We're not fighting you with fists. We're standing with the stories that built this place. The elder touched the earth with a palm. This land remembers. And just like that, everything stopped. The surveyors backed away, the wagon stayed idle, and Harlan, fuming, turned and rode off without a word. Samuel exhaled. The fight was far from over, but something had shifted. Nita looked up at him. "Are we safe now?" "No," he said, "but we're seen." "You don't get to choose the blood that makes you," Clara said. "But you sure as hell get to choose the family that saves you." The sun hung low over the western ridges, casting long amber shadows across the ranch. The snow had stopped falling, but the cold still clung like a second skin. Nita sat on the porch steps, bundled in her coat sketchpad balanced on her knees. She'd drawn the crooked sycamore 4 times already, each version a little sharper, a little more certain. Her fingers trembled from more than just cold. Something inside her had begun to stir, to swell, like the thawing creek in spring. She had a place here now, a name, a room, even chores. But still, that lingering thought. What if they changed their minds? Samuel had left early that morning with Clara to meet with the town lawyer, trying to secure the map and story into something with the weight of law. Otis, quiet since the confrontation, spent the morning in the barn sanding down a splintered stall door, as though he could smooth over his mistakes. That left Nita alone with her thoughts. Moonlight whinnied gently in the corral, steam rising from his nostrils in soft bursts. She wanted to go to him, but something tugged her back. A flicker of shame. Even now, she sometimes caught herself waiting for the next hard voice, the next cold shove out the door. The screen door creaked open behind her. "You're thinking too loud," Clara said, handing over a steaming mug. Nita smiled softly, wrapping her hands around the tin cup. "I keep waiting for someone to say it was a mistake." Clara sat beside her, gaze fixed on the fading light. "You think this family makes mistakes like that?" Nita's throat tightened. "I'm not yours." Clara didn't flinch. "Family ain't about possession, child. It's about presence. Who stays when the weather gets bad? Who stands when no one else will? I don't know how to be someone's anything." "Neither did I," once Clara admitted. "Mama died when I was 10. Pa followed a year later. Samuel and Otis took me in like a cousin, but I wasn't kin. I was just a girl with calloused hands and a smart mouth." "What changed?" Clara smiled. "I let myself stay." The wind picked up swirling old leaves around their boots. Nita looked out over the land, the barn, the ridgeline beyond. "Do you think they'll come back, Harlan and his men?" "Oh, they will," Clara said. "But now they know we won't flinch." The door creaked again, and Otis emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag face pale with purpose. "We've got company." Clara stood. "Who, Mrs. Whitlow from town? She says she knows the girl." Nita's heart froze. They met in the parlor. The woman was thin, pinched with a hat too tight on her head and gloves she didn't take off. Her eyes found Nita and narrowed. "Her name is Annabeth," she said, "from Miller's Crossing. Disappeared 6 months ago. Her father's been looking." Clara stepped between them. "She has a name." "It's Nita. That child ran off," the woman snapped. "Her mother died and her father, he's a good man. Lost without her." "Good men don't leave bruises," Clara said, voice like steel. Mrs. Whitlow blinked, unprepared for the resistance. "He's worried sick. Worried enough to sell her at an auction." The woman went pale. "I was there," Nita said, stepping forward. "He put me up like a mule, called me broken. No one wanted me, except Samuel." Samuel and Clara had returned just in time to hear the tail end of it. Samuel stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "She stays," he said. Mrs. Whitlow's lips parted. "But she stays," Clara repeated. Otis, who'd been silent for most of the exchange, crossed his arms. Unless you want a real legal mess on your hands. 'Cause we've got tribal witnesses, railroad lawyers sniffing around, and a whole town watching now. I don't think your friend wants attention. Mrs. Whitlow hesitated, then sniffed, clutching her bag closer. I'll report this. You do that, Clara said. Just make sure to include the part where she was crying on a platform with a price tag around her neck. The woman turned and left without another word. Nita stood shoulders square, but her hands trembled. Samuel placed a hand on her back. You're safe. I thought I was, she whispered. You are, he said again. But some ghosts need chasing off more than once. Later that night, the house quieted. Clara braided Nita's hair in the dim kitchen light, fingers nimble and warm. Otis busied himself stacking firewood outside a small act of penance. Samuel sat by the hearth, sharpening a knife, slow and rhythmic. I was scared she'd take me, Nita admitted. She can't, Clara said. Not anymore. Nita looked over her shoulder. Even if she came with lawmen, Samuel didn't look up. Then we'd let them see the truth. How Clara smiled. By living it every day. Nita leaned into the rhythm of the braid, letting herself believe. Before bed, she crept out to the barn. Moonlight raised his head and snorted softly. She stroked his nose, heart finally beginning to settle. I have a place now, she whispered to him. A real one. She turned toward the house lights glowing behind the curtains and took a deep breath of the crisp night air. But just as her foot touched the porch step, she saw the shadow move across the far ridge. Too fast. Too deliberate. Someone was watching. She didn't scream. She just stepped inside and quietly turned the lock. Not every battle's loud, child. Some come dressed in silence, waiting to see if you're paying attention. The morning came muted, wrapped in a veil of frost that dulled every sound. A fine sheet of ice glistened across the pasture, crackling softly under the horses' hooves. Nita stirred before dawn, still unsettled by the shadow she'd seen the night before. Her feet padded over the creaking floorboards as she slipped on her boots and coat, each movement slow and deliberate. Something had changed. The silence of the ranch no longer felt like peace, it felt like warning. She found Samuel already in the barn, brushing down moonlight with steady hands. His eyes flicked up as she approached, seeing more in her face than she wanted to admit. You saw something, he said quietly. Nita nodded. Someone on the ridge. Just standing. Watching. They were gone when I looked again. Samuel's jaw worked for a moment before he handed her the curry comb. Keep your eyes open. We'll take it from there. She didn't ask if he believed her. He did. At breakfast, Clara listened. Spoon paused halfway to her mouth, gaze sharp as glass. Otis leaned back in his chair, arms folded, expression unreadable. Could have been a drifter, he muttered. This stretch sees more now that the snow's lightened. Or it could be someone sniffing around for Harlan, Clara said. His kind don't give up easy. Otis didn't meet her eye. Let's not borrow trouble, Samuel said, though his voice lacked its usual calm. But we prepare just the same. The rest of the day ran on rails, greased with tension. Clara stayed close to Nita, watching the horizon with the kind of instinct that came from living near danger too long. Otis disappeared into the workshop behind the barn, hammering and planing something with grim purpose. And Samuel spent hours walking the perimeter rifle slung over his shoulder boots, crunching along the frozen trail. Nita tried to keep her hands busy hauling wood, helping Clara jar the last of the preserved apples, but her mind couldn't settle. The warmth of the kitchen, the scent of cinnamon and dried herbs, the hum of Clara's low singing, it all felt too fragile. Like one sharp wind might blow it away. By the time dusk fell, that unease had settled in her chest like a stone. She stood by the window of the room they'd given her, watching the last threads of sunlight bleed across the hills. The sycamore tree stood silhouetted against the gold and charcoal sky. Movement again. A flicker at the edge of the trees. She didn't hesitate. She ran. Her boots hit the porch hard. She passed the corral at a sprint, vaulting the gate with more instinct than grace. Samuel's voice called her name behind her, but she didn't stop. She crested the ridge heart, hammering. At first there was nothing, just snow rocks and winter-barren trees. Then a whisper of cloth. She turned sharply, and there he was. Harlan. Leaner than she remembered, older, but his eyes burned the same. Hat pulled low, lips curling into something between a smirk and a sneer. "Didn't expect to see you up here," he drawled. "But then again, I should have known a mutt don't forget her old master." "I'm not yours," she said. Her voice didn't shake. Not this time. He took a step closer. "That ranch ain't gonna keep you forever, girl. Men like me, we always get what's owed. Not this time." He glanced over her shoulder. "You sure one word from me and this whole fairy tale burns." "I'll scream," she warned, backing away. "That's fine. Just means they'll come faster." The click of a rifle bolt echoed like thunder across the hilltop. "Or maybe you ought to start running," Samuel said from the ridge behind her. Harlan froze, jaw tight. "I suggest you go," Samuel said, "before I forget my manners." "You think this ends it?" Harlan growled. "I think you step foot on this land again, and you'll find out just how many ways I can end it." Harlan hesitated just a breath, then turned and vanished into the tree's boots, crunching out a retreat. Samuel lowered the rifle slowly, then looked at Nita. "You all right?" She nodded, but her hands shook. He walked her home without a word, his presence quiet, steady. Clara waited at the porch, shotgun propped against her hip, and Otis stood in the shadows behind her with something heavy and metal in his grip. "He's back," Nita said simply. Clara's mouth set in a thin line. "He won't be next time." They didn't eat much that night. The ranch settled into a new rhythm. Doors locked, lights dimmed, early, weapons kept close. But underneath it all, something else stirred too. Resolve. Nita spent the next morning drawing the ridge. Not the shadow, not the fear, but the way the light spilled over the trees after Samuel stepped in. The way safety had shape and weight when someone stood for you. She didn't just want to be protected anymore. She wanted to belong in the protecting. So when Samuel asked her to ride with him into town for supplies, she said yes without hesitation. The ride into Westcott was cold but clear. The town bustled more than usual, wagons rattling, children playing near the mercantile. Samuel tied up their horses, and they stepped inside the general store, where Miss Edna looked up from her ledger and smiled. Well now, if it isn't the rancher and the little gal who caused such a stir. Nita flushed, but Samuel tipped his hat. "Just here for beans and nails, Edna. Beans and nails," she said, scribbling. Sounds about right. Nita wandered while he talked with Edna. A row of hand-stitched dresses caught her eye. She reached out, brushing the hem of one, a deep blue cotton with tiny white flowers. "You like that one?" The voice startled her. A girl about her age stood nearby with a basket on her hip. Yeah. It's pretty." "I'm June," the girl said. "My folks run the bakery next door." "Nita, you're the one from the auction. It wasn't cruel, just fact." Nita nodded. June looked at her for a long moment, then smiled. "You want to come by sometime? Mama makes peach pie that'll change your life." "I'd like that." When they rode home, Nita tucked the folded dress into her saddlebag. Samuel had bought it without a word. She didn't know what moved him to do it, but she didn't ask. As the ranch came into view over the rise, she saw Otis working on the barn roof, Clara stringing dried herbs in the kitchen window, and Moonlight trotting toward the fence. This time the shadows didn't scare her. She was learning how to see them coming. You don't have to carry the fire alone, but you do have to let others near it. The air was warm for January, a kind of deceptive gentleness that made the snow melt shimmer across the hills. Nita sat on the edge of the porch with her boots tapping lightly against the step sketchbook, balanced on her knees, and Moonlight's head resting beside her thigh. She wasn't drawing the ridge this time. Today her pencil traced the faces of those who had shaped her second chance. Samuel's weather-worn calm, Clara's sharp jaw softened by compassion, Otis's quiet watchfulness. She added June's laugh lines, even though they were more imagined than real. The girl had only visited once since their meeting in town, but she had promised to return. Still, that one visit had sparked something in Nita, a sense that maybe there was a world beyond survival. Samuel walked up from the barn sleeves, rolled a smear of oil on his arm. Otis thinks the axle on the wagon's about to give. You up for a trip to Lancaster this week? Nita looked up. Just us, just us. She swallowed hard, uncertain. Lancaster was a day's ride, bustling and wide, nothing like Westcott. Her fingers curled around her pencil. I'll go, she said. I want to. Samuel's nod was quiet approval. He didn't press her. That night the house was filled with the smell of Clara's venison stew, Otis's rare smile at something Nita said, and the low hum of safe things. But when the wind howled down from the ridge, scraping against the eaves, her thoughts drifted back to the trees. Harlan hadn't shown himself again, but his absence was its own threat. Waiting wasn't peace. It was the pause between thunder and lightning. By morning, she was ready. The ride to Lancaster was longer than she'd imagined. The trails were half-frozen patches of slush that made the horses wary. Samuel rode ahead steady and quiet, while Nita kept a hand on her saddlebag fingers, grazing the folded blue dress. When the town came into view, it felt like stepping into another world. People bustled from storefront to storefront, wagons clattered past, and the clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoed through the street. She gripped the reins tighter, breath shallow. Samuel turned in his saddle. We'll stable the horses first. Inside the mercantile, the press of bodies overwhelmed her. So many voices, so many faces. She stuck close to Samuel's side as he greeted the owner and began haggling over hardware and horse tack. Nita's eyes drifted to a rack of books in the corner, worn, bent, but beautiful. She crept toward them, fingers brushing cracked leather spines, pages that smelled of dust and ink. A voice jolted her. You read. She turned. A boy maybe a year older than her leaned against the counter nearby. His shirt was too small, collar frayed, but his eyes were curious, not mocking. Sometimes she answered cautiously. What kind of books? Ones with drawings and stories about people finding places they belong. He grinned. I'm James. My ma works the bakery. I trade chores for reading time. She gave a shy smile. Nita, want to see something neat? She hesitated, glanced at Samuel, still deep in talk with the shopkeeper. Then she followed James outside. He led her down the alley behind the store, past stacked barrels and crates. They reached a small window, covered in soot. Library, he said proudly, brushing it clean. Sort of. Old man Everett died last year, left all his books in the back room. Nobody goes in there but me. He lifted the latch, and they slipped inside. Dust hung thick in the air, lit by golden beams through the cracked roof. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books, old, weathered, and heavy with stories. Nita's heart beat faster. She ran her fingers along the shelves as though touching treasure. James climbed onto a stool and pulled down a thick volume with frayed binding. This one's got pictures. Old city sketches. It's weird, but kinda cool. They sat on the floor and flipped through the pages, knees bumping occasionally. Nita lost track of time until Samuel's voice called her name from the street. "I have to go," she said, standing quickly. James nodded. "Come back sometime. I'll save the good ones." She smiled. "I will." They rode out of Lancaster just before dusk. Nita clutched the book Samuel had bought for her, an illustrated atlas with wild landscapes she had never heard of. He hadn't said anything. When he found her with James, only handed her the book and helped her into the saddle. "You handled the crowd well," he said, as the horses trotted along the winding trail. "Better than I expected." "I was scared," she admitted. "But it was worth it." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was understanding. They camped for the night near a shallow creek. Samuel built the fire while Nita rolled out the blankets. The stars came out one by one, glittering above the black silhouettes of trees. She stared up at them, the atlas cradled against her chest. "Do you think people like us get to go places like that?" she asked quietly. Samuel looked at her from across the flames. "If they work hard enough, and don't let what's behind them keep pulling them back." Nita thought of Harlan, of the shadows she kept trying to outrun. "What if it's still chasing you? Then you make sure you're not running alone." She didn't answer, just listened to the creek and let the fire's warmth sink deep. The next morning, as they rode home, a rider passed them on the trail. The man tipped his hat and continued, but something in his eyes, cold scanning, made Nita stiffen. Samuel noticed too. He waited until they were out of earshot. He wasn't local. "No," she whispered. But he looked like someone who asks too many questions. They reached the ranch by noon. Clara met them at the porch, face drawn. "There was a man here this morning. Said he was looking for a runaway girl. Said he worked for a cattle baron down near El Paso." Nita's blood ran cold. "Did he give a name?" No, Clara said. "But he left this." She held out a silver coin. On one side was an eagle, on the other a brand Nita recognized from the burned letters on the floor of the shack she had once called home. Samuel took the coin and pocketed it without a word. "We'll talk tonight." Nita nodded, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Later after supper, she stood by the porch rail while moonlight grazed nearby. The sky burned orange and red behind the hills. Otis came and stood beside her, not speaking for a while. "Scars make good maps," he said finally. "They show where not to go back." Nita looked at him, surprised by the softness in his voice. "I don't want to be hunted forever," she said. "Then we stop being prey," Otis replied. "We fight smart. We fight together." And just like that, she knew this was no longer just a safe place. It was her place to defend. Even the hunted must decide when to stop running and when to turn and face the storm. The sound of hammering echoed from the side of the barn, sharp and purposeful. Nita stood on the fence rail, holding up a panel of fresh wood as Otis drove nails into place. They were reinforcing the back wall, a quiet understanding between them that the ranch needed more than mending, it needed preparing. Since the stranger's visit, a quiet tension had settled over the land, thick as the frost, still hugging the shadows. Clara moved around the kitchen with more urgency. Samuel kept to the ledger longer in the evening, and Otis sharpened tools after dusk with a grim focus. No one had said Harlan's name, but he was in the wind, in the tracks that came too close to the southern fence line, in the hollows of conversation left unfinished. Nida had taken to walking the ridge each morning with moonlight-close eyes scanning every rustle of the trees. The woods whispered, but nothing stepped out of them yet. Still she felt the pull, the old fear, the weight of being prey. Back inside, Clara handed her a bundle. "I stitched this for you," she said quietly. Nita unfolded it. A simple linen cloak dyed a rich plum with threadwork at the collar. Not fancy, but strong. Durable, for traveling, for deciding. If you're going to face him, it won't be in rags. Nita looked up, surprised. "You think I should? I think you've already decided to. The question now is when." That evening, the four of them sat around the table. Samuel had cleared his throat more than once before finally speaking. "He's circling," he said. "I can smell it in the way the birds go quiet near the south gate. We've patched the ranch best we can, and I've sent word to Sheriff Thomason. But I need to ask Nita, what do you want to do?" All eyes turned to her. She didn't flinch. "I want to stop running." Otis gave a single nod. Clara folded her hands. "I've been thinking," Samuel said. "He won't stop until he sees you broken or back in his grip. If we wait for him to come here, we'll be on his terms. But if we take the fight to him—" Nita's breath caught. "You know where he is." Samuel reached into his vest and pulled out a small folded map. "I spoke to a cattle trader coming up from the south. He'd heard of a man building something outside of El Paso. No law, but plenty of men with rifles." Sounded like our shadow. "We go to him," Otis said. "Quiet, smart, just enough to make sure he can't follow." Clara looked at Nita. "But only if you're ready." Nita touched the cloak in her lap. "I've been running so long I forgot I had legs for standing. Preparations took days." They traveled light, Samuel, Nita, and Otis. Clara stayed behind, keeping the ranch guarded and signaling to a few nearby allies. They knew better than to expect backup from any official channels. Power like Harlan's didn't play by rules. It rewrote them. The trail south was dry and cold. As they descended into Texas, the land grew redder, flatter. Wide skies opened above them like a canvas stretched to infinity, but even that felt close with the weight of what lay ahead. At night, they made small fires and took turns on watch. Nita read by starlight from her atlas, not for the maps anymore, but for the reminder that there were still new places untouched by fear. Otis repaired the buckles on her satchel one night, hands working steady in silence. Samuel whittled a figure of a horse and placed it in her palm before she went to sleep. It was the kind of care she'd never known before. The kind that didn't shout, but built you into someone strong enough to shout back. They reached the outer ridges of El Paso by dawn on the 6th day. Dust choked the edge of the city, and beyond that a sprawl of low buildings surrounded a sprawling ranch. Barbed fences, men with binoculars, dogs that paced like soldiers. Nita spotted the symbol on the main gate, the same as the coin, the same as the scars on her past. "That's him," she whispered. Samuel crouched beside a mesquite bush and pulled out a spyglass. "We can't storm this place, but we don't need to. There's a cattle sale tomorrow. Harlan's expected to show." Otis lifted his coat collar. "We get inside during the trade, get eyes on him. You confront him your way, and we don't linger." Nita nodded. Her heart hammered like thunder beneath her ribs, but her voice didn't shake. "Let's end it." The next morning, she was draped in the plum cloak, hair tied back, face calm. They entered the trading post on foot like common ranch hands, dusty, quiet, unremarkable. Inside the corral yard, merchants shouted over the low of cattle. Rough hands passed ledgers, contracts, cigars. Then a hush spread. Harlan had arrived. He stepped down from a black carriage coat, long hat pulled low. The air seemed to tighten around him. Men shifted to clear a path. His boots clicked over the stone like they owned it. Nita walked straight into the clearing. He paused. For a moment, silence reigned. "Well," he drawled, voice still a dagger in velvet, "I was beginning to think I'd imagined you." "I'm real," Nita said. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "You look different, but I suppose a rat changes its coat when it crawls into new holes." "I didn't crawl, I climbed." She stepped closer. The men around them stilled, unsure whether to act. Harlan's jaw twitched. "You know you belong to me." "No," she said. "I belong to no one. And you." She reached into her coat and held up a folded page, a copy of the letter she'd written to the local council, to the railmen he bribed, to the cattle barons who feared his wrath but feared exposure more. "I told them everything. The girls, the papers, the names. You're bluffing," he hissed. "Try me." Suddenly a shot rang out, but it came not from Harlan's men, but from beyond the yard. Sheriff Thomason stepped into the square, rifle raised, deputies behind him. The men around Harlan scattered like dry leaves in wind. Otis stepped forward, shotgun in hand. Samuel stayed at Nita's side, calm as ever. "You were right," Thomason said, tossing a warrant into the dirt. "Your story made its way far enough. El Paso's done protecting ghosts." Harlan lunged, but he didn't make it 3 steps before Otis and Samuel moved. He hit the dirt. Nita stood over him, cloak billowing like smoke. "You don't get to haunt me anymore." As the lawmen hauled him away, she turned toward the wide sky and let herself breathe for real. And for the first time, it didn't feel like borrowed air. The hardest part of freedom isn't walking away. It's learning how to stay when you're finally safe. The train home carved its way through miles of open country, slicing through desert plains and patches of spring-fed brush where the earth breathed again. Nita sat by the window, forehead pressed to the glass, watching tumbleweeds race the wind. The sun had risen behind them, casting long morning shadows across the hills as the steam engine rattled north. Otis dozed with his arms folded, hat tipped over his eyes. Samuel sat across from her, writing in his ledger, not numbers this time, but a poem, he said, or the beginnings of one. The quiet inside the rail car was comforting, soft, with the hush that followed storms. Nita should have felt triumphant. She had faced him, Harlan, and he was gone. Jail might hold him, or it might not, but the fear he'd branded into her skin was no longer ruling her blood. The others called it justice. But justice, she was learning, didn't always feel clean. It felt like standing on scorched ground and wondering whether anything would grow there again. At the edge of her lap, her hands were still. Not clenched, not shaking, just still. "Penny for your thoughts?" Samuel asked gently. She looked at him, then out the window again. "I thought it would feel like a sunrise, but it feels like dusk." "Maybe because a chapter ended," he said. "And you're standing in the pause before the next one begins. Do you think people like me ever really get peace?" Samuel closed the book and leaned forward. "People like you girls no one wanted. Women who've been hunted. Folks who carried too much too young." He held her gaze. "I think peace is not something you're given, Nita. It's something you learn to claim." She didn't respond right away. She just leaned her head against the window, letting the rhythm of the tracks speak where words didn't come. When they returned to Rio Mesa, the wind had shifted. Clara met them at the station, her hands dusty from working the garden, her face tight, until she saw them step off the platform whole. She pulled Nita into a hug that said more than any words could. "You did it," she whispered. "You really did it." Back at the ranch, spring had arrived early. The peach trees along the east fence bloomed pale pink, and the calves born over winter were growing strong. The house smelled like fresh herbs and baking cornbread. But something inside Nita didn't quite match the season. She walked the property alone the next morning, boots scuffing the earth as dew clung to the tips of her hem. The breeze caught her hair, tangling it, but she didn't bother brushing it back. She stopped at the edge of the stream, where she'd once hidden knees to her chest, too afraid to breathe. Now she stood tall, but the echoes remained. It was Otis who found her near sundown, still at the stream. He handed her a slice of Clara's pie wrapped in a cloth napkin. "Don't need a reason to eat good," he said simply, sitting beside her. They didn't talk for a while. The sun sank low and fireflies blinked in the early dusk. "You ever feel like you don't know who you are without the running?" she asked. Otis thought a moment. "Yeah. After the war, I kept expecting noise. Guns yelling. But all I got was quiet, and it near drove me mad." "What did you do?" He smiled slow and sad. "Started planting trees." Nita laughed, surprised. "Trees," he nodded. "One each week. Didn't matter if they grew fast or crooked. Everyone meant I chose to stay." She let the silence settle around them again. "I don't want to be defined by what I escaped," she finally said. "Then don't," Otis said. "Build something else. Something that lasts." That night, sleep came hard. She dreamt of horses galloping across ash, of voices calling her name and vanishing before she could find them. She woke to her own breath shallow and quick moonlight pouring across her quilt. She slipped out of bed and pulled on her boots. In the main room, the lantern was still burning low. She found a pen and pulled out the old atlas. This time she didn't trace an escape route. She traced a circle around Rio Mesa. Then she wrote one word beside it. Home. The next days moved slow in the way healing often does. Clara taught her how to preserve herbs for medicine, and Samuel brought her a list of books to read on law and women's rights. She found herself talking to the horses, longer letting them lean into her shoulder without shrinking back. One afternoon, she helped a young woman from town, Lydia, learn to saddle a horse. Lydia had been watching her from a distance since the trial. Nita had seen the hesitation in her eyes, the same one she'd once carried. "Don't matter where you came from," Nita told her. "Only matters where you ride next." The girl nodded, tears shining, and Nita knew she'd found a piece of herself in the act of guiding someone else. But the past had claws, and not all wounds heal smooth. A letter arrived at the ranch 1 week later, sealed in crisp paper. It came from the courthouse, but the handwriting was familiar. Harlan. Somehow from his cell he still reached for her. She stared at the envelope for a long time, fingers trembling. Clara saw and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to open it," I know, Nita whispered. But she did anyway. Inside was a single sentence. "You'll never outrun me even behind bars." Her throat tightened. She walked out to the field, fists clenched around the paper, and threw it into the fire pit. The flames crackled, then devoured it whole. Behind her, Samuel stood in the doorway. "You all right?" he asked. "No," she said honestly. "But I'm not running." That night, she took the plum cloak and draped it over the chair near the window. She didn't need it to feel brave anymore. The wind outside had changed again, softer now, bringing the scent of river sage and the far-off bloom of desert primrose. She breathed it in and felt something inside her shift, not erased, not fixed, but rooted. Maybe that was the beginning of peace. The ranch needed fencing on the west slope, and she volunteered the next morning. Clara raised a brow but didn't argue. As she walked out with tools slung across her shoulder, Otis called from behind. "You keep this up? You'll be running the place one day." Nita turned, smiled. I already am. Sometimes the weight we carry isn't just ours. It's borrowed from ghosts we never met, but still carry on our backs. The morning broke quiet, the kind of silence that hung heavy in the air before something shifted. Nita stood in the barn doorway, the scent of fresh hay and leather thick around her hands, wrapped around a warm tin cup of coffee. She'd been up since before dawn, dreams cutting short her sleep again. But she wasn't tired. She was listening. The land around Rio Mesa whispered in its own language, hooves in the dirt, fences creaking in the breeze, the rustle of prairie dogs darting in the brush. Samuel's boots crunched behind her. "Marshall passed by last night," he said. "Didn't want to wake you." Nita turned her head. "What did he want?" "He says there's word out of Las Piedras. Your mama's grave's been vandalized." The cup stilled in her hand. "Vandalized." He nodded. "Busted headstone. Torn crosses. They think it's tied to that old mine property dispute." Her stomach churned. "That grave's not near the mine. It's tucked in the south ridge, hidden. That's what makes it look personal." She turned back to the horizon, letting the wind cool her rising heat. The past had a way of clawing through even the strongest fences. Clara joined them shortly after arms crossed. "You don't have to go," she said, reading Nita's mind. "But I will," Nita answered. "That ground is sacred." Clara's silence said she understood. They left at first light the next day, just Nita and Samuel. Otis offered to ride with them, but she declined. This was something she had to face herself, and Samuel he'd walk beside her without asking for anything in return. The ride to Las Piedras took the better part of the day, the trail winding through dry canyons and the blackened trees left behind by last year's lightning fire. At dusk, they stopped at the old churchyard. The chapel had long since collapsed into ruin, but the graves remained sheltered by juniper and desert sage. Nita walked alone between the leaning stones, boots crunching gravel. She stopped when she saw it. Her mother's resting place now defaced. The cross had been snapped and tossed aside. The ground was scorched at the edges, as if someone had tried to set a fire that didn't catch. She dropped to her knees. The name carved into stone was still visible, Rosalia Two Moons. A wind picked up and carried sand across the grass. Nita brushed the debris away with her bare hands, not caring that it scraped her skin raw. Behind her, Samuel stood silent. "I was barely 8 when they buried her here," she said softly. "I came back alone that night, made this cross myself. Harlan didn't want her name remembered." "She deserves better than this," Samuel said. "She does," Nita whispered. "But this is who she was to them. An unwanted woman. An inconvenient truth. Not to you." She swallowed hard. "She used to sing to me at night, songs in Ute that no one in Harlan's house dared to hear. She was fire, and that terrified him." Samuel knelt beside her. "Then we rebuild what they tried to erase." They spent the next hour resetting the grave. Samuel cut a new cross from fallen wood, and Nita shaped the raw edge of stone with the back of her knife until the letters were sharp again. She tied a strand of her own hair around the base of the cross, a piece of herself bound to legacy. As the stars blinked into view, she spoke softly. "Mama, I'm not running anymore." Samuel placed a hand on her back. When they returned to the sheriff's office, the marshal gave them more news. Men tied to the Descombs' land claim had been spotted near the graves. Old feud, new fire. But no one had been arrested. "They know who did it," Nita said. "Knowing ain't proving," the marshal replied. "And out here, proving's the only thing that holds." Nita looked him square in the eye. "Then I'll prove it." Samuel tried to reason with her as they rode back. "You've got a home now. A life. You don't need to chase ghosts to feel strong. It's not about strength, she said. It's about respect. For her. For every woman they buried in silence. He didn't push. He just rode beside her. That night, under stars thick as dust, Nita took out her journal. Not to write about vengeance or names, but to draw. She sketched her mother's grave as it should be framed in flowers, guarded by light. The next morning, Clara was waiting on the porch, as if she'd known what news they'd bring. "You still planning to meet with the land council?" she asked. Nita nodded. "I'll need their blessing to mark the gravesite. I want to protect it legally." Clara handed her a folded paper. "Then take this. A map of the South Ridge drawn by your mama. She gave it to me the night before they took her. Said one day Nita will need to find her way." The paper shook in Nita's hands as she unfolded it. Her mother's handwriting was small and looping, the kind taught in mission schools, but filled with old meaning. In the corner was a symbol, 2 moons side by side. She marked every place she thought sacred, Clara said, not just her grave. Nita traced the ink with her fingertip. "I'll protect them all." "Then you'll need help," Otis said, stepping outside. "Good men, good women who know the land and care for it." Samuel looked at her. "You ready to build something that lasts longer than pain?" She looked toward the horizon, the wind in her hair, the memory of her mother's voice brushing her shoulders. "I'm ready to build a legacy." We weren't just fighting for land. We were fighting for the right to remember, to mourn, to exist without apology. Nita stood before the tribal council in the circular chamber of the old lodge, the warm scent of cedar lingering in the beams above. Her mother's map lay flat on the table in front of the elders, worn at the creases, the ink faded in places, but still legible. The council had been quiet as she spoke, listening without interruption. "These places marked here," she said, tapping a weathered finger at the southern ridge, "are burial grounds. But they're more than that. They're memory. My mother died trying to protect that memory, and someone's trying to erase it again." Across the table, Elder Tahoma studied her with unreadable eyes. He was the oldest among them, his silver braid hanging over one shoulder. Beside him sat his daughter Lena, a younger council member who had grown up with Nita before their paths split. "What you ask," Tahoma said slowly, "is not just for a boundary. You ask for history to be honored where law has not seen it." "Yes," Nita said, "because if we don't protect it now, they'll keep desecrating our dead. They'll keep pretending we never lived here." Lena leaned forward. "And you're certain it was the Descombs men?" Nita nodded. "Marshall didn't say it, but the signs are there. They knew where the grave was. No one else did." "And what would you do, child of 2 moons, if the council says no?" Tahoma asked. "I'll still fight," she replied. "But I'd rather fight with my people at my side." A hush fell over the room. From the back, Samuel watched his arms crossed, but his stance relaxed. He knew Nita didn't need him to speak here. This was her voice, her history, her stand. He was there to witness, not to interfere. After a long moment, Tahoma rose. "You will have our blessing. The land you seek to protect will be marked under tribal care. But that will not stop the men who believe their money is law." Nita bowed her head. "Then we meet them on both fronts." As they left the lodge, Lena followed her outside. "You're stirring up old dust, Nita. Some folks don't like remembering what was taken." "I don't expect them to like it," Nita said. "I expect them to respect it." The wind picked up again, carrying the scent of pinyon smoke. Down the slope, riders gathered near the edge of the village, waiting to escort her back to Rio Mesa. Word had spread fast about the vandalism, the threat, the stand she was taking, and folks had started choosing sides. By the time she returned, Otis had already organized 6 ranchers from the neighboring territories. Clara stood at the porch with a notebook scribbling names. They're offering supplies patrol support, and a few are willing to testify about the Descombes land grabs, Clara said, eyes bright. I think they're tired of the same old story being told. Then let's give them a new one, Nita said. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Maps were drawn, fence lines surveyed, and watch shifts established. Men and women of all backgrounds came forward, Ute, Mexican, Irish freedmen who'd carved space into the harsh soil. They saw in Nita not just a girl fighting for a grave, but a woman daring to claim space in a world that tried to make her disappear. Samuel worked long hours alongside Otis, repairing the east fence where riders had been seen lurking. They moved with quiet determination, speaking in short bursts, the kind of rhythm that comes when two men understand each other without needing many words. One afternoon, as Nita checked supplies in the barn, a stranger approached on horseback. Dust coated his boots, and a scar ran across his cheek, catching the light as he removed his hat. Name's Ed Harlan, he said, voice low. Nita froze. You're his son, grandson, he corrected. Harlan's dead now. Been a long time since anyone said his name like it mattered. What do you want, I came to say. Not all of us are like him, Ed said. My father left that land when he was young. Told me stories later after the war about your mother. Said she was the only light in that whole cursed house. Nita stared, her throat dry. He made me promise that if I ever came west, I'd find you. Said you'd need help one day. She laughed once, bitter and sharp. So now you're here to play the hero? No, ma'am. I'm here to stand where my grandfather never did. And to tell you Descombes has hired men. Rough ones, not from around here. Her face darkened. When they're coming soon, maybe tonight. She looked past him out to the hills, glowing orange in the setting sun. Then we'll be ready. That night, every lantern at Rio Mesa burned bright. Men and women took posts at the ridge near the graves along the creek bed. Shotguns were cleaned. Messages were sent. Nita sat inside the small chapel they'd begun rebuilding at the edge of the sacred site. A fire crackled in the corner, casting shadows against the new timbers. She held her mother's journal in her lap, running a finger along the margins. Samuel entered quietly. Everything's in place, he said. She nodded, not looking up. She wrote about him once, Harlan. Said he smiled like a knife and kissed like a promise he never kept. Samuel stepped closer. You carry her courage. I carry her rage, too. He knelt in front of her. Just don't let it burn you from the inside. She looked at him, eyes rimmed red. If I fall, will you bury me here? He didn't hesitate. Yes, but you're not falling. Outside, dogs barked. A sharp whistle split the night. They moved as one, rising into the wind, into the storm they knew was coming. They were no longer just caretakers of the land. They were its defenders. Memory had become mission. Love had become law. And Nita had become something her enemies never expected, a living monument. Unmovable. Unbreakable. A woman whose presence told the truth even when others tried to silence it. You can't threaten people who've already lost everything. That's when they become dangerous. The night cracked open with gunfire. It began at the eastern fence line. A single shot followed by the frenzied barking of dogs and the pounding of hooves against packed dirt. Nita was already halfway out the chapel door when the second volley echoed through the canyon, closer this time. The lanterns strung along the property cast frantic shadows as riders appeared at the ridgeline, 3, then 5, then more faces, masked, rifles raised. They're here, someone shouted from the barn. Samuel met her at the steps, already armed. Otis is at the ridge with Clara and 2 others. I'll head for the southern fence. They're trying to split our line. Nita gripped his arm. Don't let them draw you away. Their goal isn't the cattle or the fences, it's the graves. He nodded once and vanished into the darkness like he'd been born in it. Nita turned toward the burial site, feet pounding across the open field past the creek that shimmered with starlight. A dozen locals had already taken position near the makeshift chapel. Elder Tahoma stood among them, a rifle slung over his shoulder, his old war coat buttoned to the collar. His presence was both unexpected and grounding. "I figured if a woman like you was brave enough to stand," he said, "the least I could do was watch her back." She barely had time to answer. The horsemen surged forward from the north, cutting across the dry brush with reckless force. They weren't from Rio Mesa, that much was obvious, mercenaries, hired men with no stake in the land. But they had orders. And someone had paid them well. "Fire only if they cross the boundary," Nita shouted. "We don't give them reason to spin this against us." The line held. For the first few minutes it was all intimidation, bluff charges, shouts, firebrands thrown onto the fields. Smoke curled upward, but the winds blew it back toward the riders. The flames sputtered in defeat, much like the men who'd cast them. Then one rider broke the line. A lanky man with a scarred jaw charged the burial ground gun raised, heading straight for the chapel. Nita didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, leveled her rifle, and fired. The shot rang out like thunder. The man crumpled mid-gallop, falling sideways off his horse. The animal veered off and disappeared into the dark. There was a stunned pause, both sides registering that she'd meant what she said. This wasn't for show. This was war. Then chaos erupted. Shots lit up the night tracer fire, tearing across the boundary, finding bark, bone, and air. The defenders of Rio Mesa returned fire with steady aim, protecting the line not with hatred, but with ancestral resolve. Nita moved between cover points, checking on each post, dragging the wounded back behind the chapel where Clara had set up a triage tent. Otis had taken a graze to the arm. Another rancher had a bullet lodged in his thigh. But they were alive. They were still standing. From the southern slope, Samuel emerged, dragging a limp figure by the collar, a rider whose bravado had outpaced his skill. He dropped him at Nita's feet. This one said Descombs promised they'd be rewarded double if they desecrated the graves. He said, breathing hard. "He made it personal," Nita murmured. "He always does." The rider groaned. Nita knelt and stared into his bloodied face. "Tell them this land is guarded. Tell them we remember." The man blinked, unsure if she meant her people or her dead. It didn't matter. Because the battle ended as quickly as it began. The rest of the raiders, realizing they were outmatched and outmaneuvered, retreated into the hills. Their silhouettes vanished into the night, leaving behind only wounded pride and the occasional smear of blood on rock and earth. Silence returned, thick and weighty. Nita stood in the chapel doorway, watching the sun rise over the far ridge. The light spilled slowly across the land, gilding the broken fences, the bullet-pocked barrels, and the faces of those who had chosen to stay. Behind her, Tahoma lit a ceremonial pipe. "You did it." "No," she said quietly. "We did it." Clara approached, brushing dust from her skirt, face streaked with soot and tears. "The county marshal's coming. Someone sent word during the attack. Probably Lena. They'll want answers." "They'll get them," Nita replied. "On our terms." Otis sat on a nearby stump, bandage wrapped around his bicep. He chuckled. "I always thought I'd go out kicking over fence posts, not defending sacred ground with a shotgun and a rancher's daughter." "You picked the right fight," Nita said. That afternoon, the marshal arrived with deputies, eyes wide as they took in the charred ground and the makeshift barricades. Nita met them at the chapel, surrounded by elders, ranchers, and even children, those who had carried water-patched wounds, lit fires, and stood as witnesses. The rider Samuel captured was turned over. Eyewitnesses spoke. Testimonies were signed. And for once, the law didn't look the other way. 3 days later, the county issued a temporary restraining order against Descombes and any of his hired men, pending a formal investigation. It wasn't justice in full, but it was something. That night, the people of Rio Mesa gathered under the stars. The sacred grounds were ringed in light. Food was passed. Music played. Someone strummed an old guitar. An elder recited the names of the buried, a loud voice thick with memory. Nita stood at the edge of the circle, arms folded, watching it all unfold. The laughter, the tears, the joy that comes only after standing on the edge and refusing to fall. Samuel joined her, a flask in hand. "You were right," he said, "about what grief does have a rhythm. And sometimes when it's loud enough, it shakes the ones who think they're above it." She smiled faintly, eyes still scanning the crowd. "We're not done yet." "No," he agreed. "But now you're not doing it alone." Nita exhaled slowly. She could still feel the fire in her bones, the fear, the fury, the ache of loss. But she could also feel something deeper now, something stronger, the unshakable weight of belonging. And in that moment, as the wind rustled the prayer flags overhead and the stars blinked down in silent witness, she realized what they'd truly defended. Not just graves, not just stories, but the right to exist and to rise. The educational lesson learned from this story is that standing your ground, especially for what is sacred, just or deeply personal, can awaken a strength you didn't know you had. When community memory and legacy are under threat, even those who've been cast aside or underestimated can become fierce defenders of what truly matters. This story reminds us that dignity isn't granted by others. It's held within, and when shared with others who believe in the same values, it becomes unshakable. For those who've lived long enough to see both loss and renewal, it's a gentle reminder: courage doesn't fade with age, it deepens.